Today I want to challenge two popular misconceptions in the Waxman-Markey climate change and energy bill that's now before the Senate after passing the House of Representatives. The first is the idea that deliberately raising prices will somehow be good for job growth in the economy, and the second is that whatever the problems created by Waxman-Markey, they can mostly be resolved by building more windmills. Waxman-Markey started out as a bill to reduce carbon emissions in order to deal with climate change. It's ended up as a $100 billion a year energy tax nailed to renewable energy mandates that will saddle consumers with expensive energy for years to come. Instead of a broad-based national clean energy policy, Waxman-Markey has given us literally a narrow, expensive national windmill policy. Now, I believe that cheap energy means good jobs, and my perspective, of course, comes from Tennessee. For example, Alcoa, where my dad worked, has shut down its smelter. It's aluminum smelter. It's waiting for cheaper electricity from the Tennessee Valley Authority. Goodman, a company in Fayetteville that makes a lot of air conditioners, tells me that if their electricity prices go up, those jobs go overseas. Eastman Chemical employs 7,000 Tennesseans, uses coal as a feedstock. It says that if Waxman-Markey goes through, those jobs might be headed overseas. The Valero refinery in Memphis employs 600 people refining fuels, including jet fuel for Federal Express at its Memphis hub. Waxman-Markey would cost Valero, it says, $400 million or more per year, and today Valero's profits are $40 million per year at that refinery. We have two big supercomputers at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, in part because of our abundance of low-cost electricity. Just one of those machines uses 7 megawatts, and nationwide, 5% of all of our electricity use is now computers, and that is growing. Our governor has done a good job of recruiting 2 big new plants that make polysilicon for solar cells. These are the green jobs that everyone loves to talk about. Each of those plants uses 120 megawatts. If they can't make affordable solar cells, they can't pay high electricity costs. A third of Tennessee's manufacturing jobs are in auto manufacturing. Auto parts suppliers watch their costs, including electricity costs. Thanks a lot, Ken. And if those costs go up too much, they'll be making auto parts in Mexico or Japan instead of Tennessee and Michigan. And it's not just companies. Last year, 10% of Nashvillians, even with TVA's relatively low residential electric rates, said they couldn't afford to pay their electric bills. So let's step back for a moment and ask, what kind of America are we trying to create with our energy policy? We want an America in which we have enough clean, cheap, and reliable energy to create good jobs and run a prosperous industrial and high-tech society. In order to support the American economy that creates 25% of the world's wealth, we need to produce each year about 25% of the world's energy. We want an America in which we're not creating excessive carbon emissions and running the risk of encouraging global warming. We want an America with cleaner air, where smog in Los Angeles and the Great Smoky Mountains is a thing of the past, and where our children are less likely to suffer asthma attacks brought on by breathing pollutants. We want an America, I believe, in which we're not creating an energy sprawl by occupying vast tracts of farmlands, deserts, mountaintops with energy installations that ruin the landscape. The great American outdoors is a revered part of our country. We've spent a century preserving it. We do not want to destroy the environment in the name of saving the environment. We want an America in which we create hundreds of thousands of green jobs, but not at the expense of destroying tens of millions of red, white, and blue jobs. It doesn't make any sense to employ people in renewable energy if we're going to throw them out of work in manufacturing and high tech. And that's what could happen if these new technologies raise the price of electricity too much. We want an America where we're the unquestioned champion in cutting-edge scientific research and lead the world in creating new technologies. And we want an America capable of producing enough of our own energy so that we can't be held hostage by some other energy-producing country. None of these goals are met by Waxman-Markey. The bill provides a huge new tax on the economy. In addition, it requires that 15% of our electricity come from a narrowly defined group of renewable sources, defined as wind, solar, geothermal, and biomass. While promising and intriguing, we can't expect renewable energy to do anything more for the foreseeable future than supplement our current base of our current baseload electrical production. It cannot replace it. What the Waxman-Markey bill proves once again is that one of the government's biggest mistakes is taking a good idea, renewable energy, and expanding it until it doesn't work anymore. Republican senators have a better idea. Produce more American energy and use less. First, we should build 100 new nuclear reactors over the next 20 years, just as we did between 1970 and 1990. That'd double the level of our nuclear generation to 40% of our electricity. Add 10% for sun and wind and other renewables, another 10% for hydroelectric, maybe 5% more for natural gas. And by 2030, we begin to have a low-cost, clean energy policy that also puts us within sight of meeting the goals of the Kyoto Protocol on global warming. Step 2 is to electrify half our cars and trucks. This should reduce dependence on foreign oil by about 1/3. Clean the air and keep fuel prices low. According to estimates by Brookings scholars, we could do this with the unused nighttime electricity we already have today without building one new power plant. Step 3 is to explore offshore for natural gas, which is low carbon, and oil. We should use less, but more of our own. And the final step is to double funding for energy research and development and launch what I like to call mini Manhattan projects, like the one we had in World War II. Except these would be in energy research and development, improving batteries for plug-in vehicles, making solar power cost competitive, making carbon capture from coal plants a reality, safely recycling used nuclear fuel, designing green buildings, perfecting advanced biofuels, even providing energy from nuclear fusion. Basically, I believe our policy should be to conserve and use our nuclear, gas, and oil resources until we figure out how to make renewable and alternative energies more reliable and cost competitive. Instead of following the simple, fourfold, low-cost, clean energy strategy, the Obama administration wants to spend tens of billions of dollars covering an area the size of West Virginia with 50-story wind turbines while it squirms uncomfortably at every mention of nuclear power. According to the San Francisco Chronicle last week, quote, the Department of Energy is starting a new partnership with the nation's 6 largest wind turbine manufacturers in an effort to provide 20% of the nation's energy from wind by 2030, a goal the DOE says is within reach, unquote. Just to give you some sense of this, that would be by estimates between 130,000 and 180,000 wind turbines. These are not your grandmother's windmills. They're 3 times as tall as our football stadium in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the blade is 100 yards, the football field, and they come in farms. The President in his inaugural address spoke eloquently of powering the country with the wind, the sun, and the earth. And in June, the Wall Street Journal asked Boone Pickens, Amory Lovins, Al Gore, and President Obama how to reduce dependence on foreign oil and contribute less to climate change. These 4 came up with 24 suggestions, ranging from placing veterans in green jobs to generating 20 to 30% of electricity by wind, but made not one mention of nuclear power, which produces 70% of our carbon-free, pollution-free electricity. Over the next 10 years, the wind industry will receive direct federal taxpayer subsidies of about $28 billion, according to the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. Most of this is in a so-called production tax credit for renewable energy that was passed in 1992 and was supposed to be temporary. It's worth about 3 cents per kilowatt hour to wind developers and cost taxpayers $26 billion. 3/4 of that renewable tax credit has gone to wind. Solar, geothermal, biomass, and hydropower make up the rest. Then there's $1 billion for construction subsidies through clean renewable energy bonds. Then there'll be an investment tax credit for residential and small industrial wind turbines. There'll also be accelerated depreciation of small wind turbines. Plus, there's $11 billion provided by the stimulus package for building a smart grid and new transmission lines. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation tells us the entire U.S. grid needs upgrading, but the transmission projects so far will all go to bringing wind and solar electricity from remote places to population centers. And all this doesn't even mention the Waxman-Markey renewable energy mandates, which will have the practical effect of forcing utilities in many states to buy government-subsidized wind energy they don't necessarily need from faraway states with better wind resources. Let me give you an example. Between 2000 and 2004, the TVA constructed a 30-megawatt wind farm at Buffalo Mountain in Tennessee at a cost of $60 million. That is the only wind farm in the southeastern United States. Now, you'll read in the papers that having a 30-megawatt wind farm means generating 30 megawatts of electricity. But that's only what they call nameplate capacity. That's not real output. In practice, Buffalo Mountain has only generated electricity 19% of the time, since the wind doesn't blow very much in the southeast. That means TVA will pay $60 million over 20 years to generate 6 megawatts of electricity. Multiply this out and you'll see it means spending $10 billion to generate 1,000 megawatts, which is about the output of one nuclear reactor, which makes Tennessee windmills much more expensive than the costliest nuclear reactor. TVA considers Buffalo Mountain to be a failed experiment. In fact, looking for wind power in the southeast is a little like looking for hydropower in the desert. Nevertheless, Waxman-Markey will effectively force TVA and every other utility in the country to get at least 12% of its electricity from these narrowly defined renewable sources. Hydroelectric dams, for example, are probably the best source of renewable energy, but they don't count. I'm not sure exactly why. Nuclear doesn't count as renewable either, even though we've got plenty of uranium, and reprocessing the fuel could stretch that fuel out for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the TVA set about requesting bids for 1,250 megawatts of renewable power that it doesn't really need and may not be able to use. In our country, wind now produces 1.3% of our total electricity, 4.5% of our clean electricity. Yet, according to the Energy Information Administration, wind turbines are being subsidized at 30 times the rate of all other renewables and 19 times the rate of nuclear, which, as I mentioned earlier, produces 70% of our carbon-free, pollution-free electricity. So instead of a clean, broad-based energy policy, or even a clean, renewable energy policy, what we have in practice is truly a national windmill policy. But wait a minute, they tell us, all this really isn't about producing clean, cheap energy. It's about creating green jobs. There are a couple of problems with this argument. First, there must be at least as many welders and mechanics and construction workers that would be employed in building 100 new nuclear power plants during the next 20 years as in all the renewable projects put together. Second, while there may be hundreds of thousands of green jobs, there are tens of millions of red, white, and blue jobs that will be quickly lost because of rising energy prices. For example, Spain is one of the leading countries in Europe when it comes to implementing renewable electricity generation. One Spanish university found that for every green job created, Spain is losing more than 2 jobs somewhere else in the economy, mainly in energy-intensive sectors such as metallurgy, mining, and food processing. Meanwhile, France, which is getting 80% of its electricity from nuclear power plants and has among the lowest electric rates in Europe, as well as lowest carbon emissions, is luring away Spain's major industries with its cheap power. Let's come close to home and look at California, where they've been imposing renewable mandates for years. California hasn't built a baseload coal or nuclear plant in more than 20 years. It's built a lot of renewables. I believe all this has contributed mightily to the electricity shortage of 2000. Now the state has the highest electricity prices in the continental U.S. west of Washington, D.C. Manufacturers are leaving in droves. Even Google and Yahoo are building their server farms elsewhere. With all this job loss, the state has 11.6% unemployment, and last week a $28 billion budget gap. Its bond rating is now the lowest of all the states. I can't believe that the high cost of electricity in California hasn't contributed to this. But this hasn't tempered the state's enthusiasm for renewable energy. California lawmakers are moving their renewable energy standard from 20 to 33% by 2020. State energy agencies say that could cost $114 billion or more than double what meeting the original standard cost. According to the Wall Street Journal's news page on July 3rd, the state auditor of California warned this week that the electricity sector poses a high risk to the state economy. A staff report from the State Energy Commission warns that California could find itself uncomfortably tight on power by 2011 if problems continue to pile up, and that's a quote. Renewable energy is intriguing and useful, but today it's only 4% of our electricity, and it has many challenges. One is that many people forget that wind and solar is only available on average about a third of the time, and it can't be stored in commercial quantities with current technology. So you use it or you lose it. Denmark, with the world's biggest percentage of wind power, claims to get 20% of its electricity from wind. Yet it still produces 40% of its power with coal and imports more than 25% of consumed electricity from Sweden and Germany. Moreover, it's not clear that their carbon emissions have decreased over the last 10 years. Then there's what conservation groups are beginning to call the energy sprawl, and which we're only beginning to come to grips with. One nuclear plant generates 1,000 megawatts of electricity and occupies about 1 square mile. Compare that to one big solar thermal power plant, with mirrors generating the same 1,000 megawatts in the west. That would occupy 30 square miles. That's more than 5 miles on a side. Or to generate the same 1,000 megawatts with wind, you'd need 270 square miles. That's more than 4 times the size of Washington, D.C. That's an unbroken line of 50-story turbines from Johnson City, Tennessee, along scenic ridge tops to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. If wind farms move offshore, you'd need to line the entire 127-mile New Jersey coast with windmills 2 miles deep just to replace one nuclear reactor that sits on a square mile. And we haven't even talked about what happens in 15 or 20 years when the wind turbines wear out. Who's responsible for removing them? We have a real problem with abandoned landmines, with abandoned mines in America today. They're like, well, they are land. With abandoned mines in America today, there are 47,000 in California. We're spending a lot of money to clean them up. We haven't even required developers to put up bonds when they put up these big structures. And to those of us in the southeast, where the wind blows less than 20% of the time, they say, well, you can use biomass. Well, biomass is sort of a controlled bonfire. It's when you burn wood. And it's a good idea up to a point, but we can't get carried away with it. We'd need a forest 1.5 times the size of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and we'd have to continuously cut the trees to feed a 1,000-megawatt biomass plant on a sustained basis. And of course, it'd take hundreds of trucks to deliver the wood to the biomass plant every day. It's hard to me to see how that reduces carbon emissions. Already, we're beginning to see the problems. Boone Pickens, who said that the turbines are too ugly to put on his own ranch, recently postponed what was to be America's largest wind farm because of the difficulty of building transmission lines from West Texas to population centers. The same thing happened with the Sacramento Municipal Utility District in California. I hope that renewable energy can be reliable and low cost enough to supplement. But when we talk about using wind energy as a substitute for base load energy, like coal or nuclear, we haven't thought about what it's going to look like in practice. Nuclear power, as I've said, produces 20% of all of our electricity in America, but 70% of our pollution-free, carbon-free electricity. It's so profitable there's enough to pay back construction loans and still have low electric rates. For example, TVA's Browns Ferry unit will be repaid in 3 years, not in 10 as been expected, and that means its profits can go to keep rates low. Nuclear power receives very little in terms of federal subsidies. All 100 plants we have today were built with private funds. A lot of changes have happened in the last 30 years since the United States last built a new nuclear power plant. One of those is that the rest of the world has started to build them at a rapid rate. France is now 80% nuclear. Japan builds 1 a year. American taxpayers are helping India and China build nuclear power plants for low-cost, clean energy, and the President has even said Iran may build a nuclear power plant. We can't wait any longer to start building our own future with clean, reliable, and affordable energy. The time has come for action. We can revive America's industrial and high-tech economy with the technology we invented and that we already have at hand. The only requirement is that we open our minds to the possibilities and potential of nuclear power. And as we do, our policy of cheap and clean energy based upon nuclear power, electric cars and trucks, offshore exploration, and doubling energy research and development will help family budgets and create jobs. It will also prove to be the fastest way to increase American energy independence, clean the air, and reduce global warming. Thank you.